can't start an eclectic utopian idea with sparkling ideas and verbiage and high-minded ideals that people want to push forward and create a better world with without attracting a bunch of nuts. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. And certainly one of your chief class of nuts are artists and writers for the most part, but they're also some of the most influential artists of the last century and this century came to Fairhope. And I'm going to start with, this is, of course, Progress and Poverty, written by Henry George. This inspired Fairhope and the ideals behind Fairhope, and as I told you, is still inspiring countries like England, Norway, Finland, Sweden to espouse these type of ideas. Economic rent, land value taxation, as I explained the other day. How many communities do you know that were founded on a book, or the ideals within a book? And as I told you, when this came out in 1879 for the next decade, it only was outsold by the Bible. So that was a very, very influential book. Why don't you hear about it? Because there are a number of economics departments in major universities that were funded by the super wealthy at this time who said, I will fund your entire economics department if you do not teach Georgist economics. And so there was a deliberate campaign by these people to quell this very fair and even-handed method of creating and distributing revenue. I'm not a socialist, I'm not a communist, but I think everybody should have a fair shake. And just because you own something and are making money off it for nothing doesn't mean you should continue to do so at the expense of others. That's just the way I feel about it. And so did he. And like I said, everybody in this whole lecture either looks like Gabby Hayes, Wyatt Earp, or one of the Smith brothers. So that's, and that's certainly Henry George. If you flipped him over, you can make a Smith brothers package. I told you the other day that Lizzie Magie, early on, created in 1905, she patented, well, 1904, she patented the landlord's game, the name of it, as a single tax game. And she put George Street and Fairhope Avenue and Johnson Circle in there. And I told you how this now has flipped, and it's now an anti-single tax. So that if you haven't got enough money to buy Marvin Gardens and somebody else does, what happens when you land on Marvin Gardens? Rent. You get all your rent. That person gets rent every time you land on it. So they just sit back and earn vast amounts of money. And it's all right to a degree, but you can see what happens when you put that on a national scale. Early artists who came to Fairhope, we talked a little bit about Floy May Schermerhorn, who had her tent. This is one of her tents, on their company that would set up. The advance man would go in. They'd put up their big posters on the wall boards. That's where wallpaper paste was used, and then the plaster was stuck up. You hear today 24-sheet posters for billboards, which is a standard 12 by 24. That was started back in these days because they'd have huge posters. They would put part of it up, then another sheet of it up, and quite often they were 10, 12, 24 sheets. And they'd advertise what was coming in. She was born in 1882, but her daughter wrote the book called Trooping Across America. And it's a wonderful book about how these people would set up and move through the United States, mostly the Midwest, and set up and entertain people. And she came, of course, to Fairhope and set up, she did A Midsummer Night's Dream down on the bay. And we had Shakespearean festivals all through the 20s. The Great Depression kind of cut that back a little bit. But did I tell you about my father-in-law as a little boy watching one of these performances? And it was a Robin Hood play. And a horse came galloping underneath the tree in the gully, and a man jumped on the galloping horse as it was going through the tree. He said, that's live theater. That's really good. Unless you miss the horse, in which case you have to reboot your performance. The Fairhope Light Opera Company, they, of course, performed around the county. And as I said, we don't know too much about them, except they certainly enjoyed getting dressed up and posing for pictures. This is down on the Fairhope Beach, I think just to the left of the big pier. Another writer, artist, was Marietta Johnson. We talked about Marietta Johnson's work. Her 30 years of an idea inspired a number of people, such as John Dewey, the great American educational authority, whose seminal book, Schools of Tomorrow, one of the editions actually had a picture of Marietta Johnson on it, who he devoted a whole chapter in the book to about what schools need to be. And you can see Dewey was on the cover of Time. He wrote, he wrote hundreds of books, and just didn't die until 1952, but was a great man in American letters, and he lived in Fairhope for a while to study Marietta Johnson. The art in the Organic School. The Organic School was a fantastic place. The school home I mentioned the other day where Clarence Darrow lived and so many people came to stay, that's the old school home. That's where that table in my studio comes from. It's out of the school home where they all used to gather and what was it? We have a woman who used to work in our office, and she had a wonderful way with the English language. And one morning somebody said, why don't you eat at Julewin's? And she said, Julewin's, that's where all the men go to conjugate in the back. And I got this picture of these guys in overalls going, a bow, a boss, a bombus. Okay, Earl, it's your turn. So anyway, that's where all these folks went to conjugate when they had coffee and such. The Organic School also had a drama troupe that was well known. The other day you saw a brand new building where I said the theater had burned down. This is what used to be there, the Magnet Theater. Now this was a town, we had probably only about 500 people in Fairhope when he built this theater. So this theater could probably hold 2/3 to 3/4 of the whole town. But it did a thriving business because he was very much interested. This is Judge Totten. Remember the nudist story I told you about the mailman eventually just threw the letters over the...
You just told us in the car.
Oh, right, in the bus. But Judge Totten, this is the guy that built the movie theater. I doubt he did any exhibitions there, but I haven't heard of any yet.
Tell us the story.
Pardon me?
Tell us the nude story.
The nude story, well, we had some rogue nudists, I think that you could call it. And of course, bathing suits in the early 1900s, especially for women, were incredibly cumbersome. And so a lot of people would just wait until the sun went down and go a little north of Fairhope, away from the main pavilions and things there, and they'd take off their clothes and go out and bathe in the evening. And I don't know if cavorting went on or not. I don't really, as is oft happens, there might have been some, but nonetheless, it was mostly discreet. And we had a librarian, Marie Howland, and you'll see a picture of her later. I remember talking to a couple of old timers who said they used to hide in the bushes near the library where she lived, and she would come out at night with nothing but a towel over her shoulder and a bar of soap. And she wasn't Marilyn Monroe, I can tell you that, but the fellow said that as young children, they just never had seen a naked woman before, and that's Nekked. So anyway, but there was that story. But Judge Totten, he had a house on Morphy Avenue that's still there, and it had high bushes around it. So the mailman on his deliveries, they used to go up and just deliver it to the house. But he got tired of going through the gate and by these bushes and being shocked by this naked man walking around in the yard. So he got fed up with it. So he just started throwing the mail over the top of the bush. So anyway, so that's the story about Judge Totten. But I guess all small towns have some stories like this. But the organic players, like down here, there's example and up here, they would put on plays like the 1915 The Man Who Married a Dumb Wife. So there were... Now, the traveling troupe, I think I told you the other day, that went through the Midwest, they basically had 5 plays, but all they really were different names. They had an ingenue, they had a hero, they had an evil villain, blah, 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 blah. And so they constantly, the older guy who played the villain generally was an alcoholic, so they'd have to constantly try to find somebody else or prop him up to go out on stage. It's just one of those wonderful... And if the theater's changed that much, I don't really know. It seems, right, life imitating art or whatever. But anyway, that's all very interesting. Upton Sinclair, I mentioned him the other day. Now, the Jungle, of course, which was his magnificent book about the meatpacking in Chicago and the horrible, horrible conditions that were there. really exposed in the age of muckraking journalism in McClure's. And I think I told you that you really need to read, if you haven't read it, The Bully Pulpit. If you really want an understanding, it's Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the populist era, or the progressive era. People like Upton Sinclair changed journalism. Not only did he help create the Pure Food Act by Roosevelt. I mean, Roosevelt directly quotes and honors Upton Sinclair. He said he didn't want anything to do with him because he was a crazy socialist. But he said he's got the right idea, and we need to change. We need to have conditions under which people can have safe food. And how many hundreds of thousands or millions of people's lives has that saved over the years? So Upton Sinclair lived in Fairhope. He was a vegetarian. He was very thin. Yeah, a vegetarian who's very thin. It seems like you're being redundant. But nonetheless, he was so thin because he would go on these bizarre diets. He read that if you ate very high quality beef pate, that would be good for you. It would help give you iron and protein and other things. But there's a story of him walking up and down in front of the butcher shop for about 2 hours and still going back because he couldn't quite make up his mind to go in there and get the pate. But so if you walk downtown at that time, you might see Upton Sinclair just sort of walking up and down in front of the butcher shop, wondering whether or not he should go in and get some pate. But he had a wife that he had an interesting. He kind of didn't do anything about marriage, if that's any way to really phrase that. And his wife eventually ran off with somebody else because they would. So he led kind of a solitary life. He ran for governor of California in the 1930s. He helped, he won a Pulitzer Prize in 1943. He wrote The Brass Check, which was about the excesses that journalists would take or hyperbole that they would use in reporting things. And he said, that's wrong. You need to stick to the facts. You know, how, who, why, what, and where. And that he helped change or create the very next year after he wrote The Brass Check, they created journalistic standards, which we have today. So he was a very important figure in American literature and in American society to do that. Now, we had Sherwood Anderson came here. Has anybody here ever heard of Sherwood Anderson?
A playwright.
Yes, and a book and an author also. Born in 1876 and he died in 1941. But in 1919 he was in Mobile visiting, and he was in a kind of a rooming house, and he found $140 in the rooming house. Now in 1919 that was a whole lot of money, and so he'd heard about Fairhope, and so he decided he was going to come over here and spend the winter in Fairhope. And he stayed for more than the winter. But he wrote Dark Laughter in 1925, which was a bestseller. Now, he influenced, by their own volition, admission, he influenced Hemingway, Faulkner, Steinbeck, and Thomas Wolfe. All of them acknowledge Sherwood and Anderson's contributions to their writing styles and just the way they look at literature. I think that's a pretty profound. But he also wrote Triumph of the Egg. He wrote that with his 22nd wife or something like that when he came over here. He was sort of in and out of depression and wives for quite some time. This, of course, is Clarence Darrow. The table that you saw in my studio the other day, Darrow used to come, and Sinclair and Anderson, and all of these people would go to that school home and they'd share coffee and argue and discuss things. But Darrow, I think, is if you can think of a more august legal figure in the 20th century, let me know. I mean, we have had some remarkable Supreme Court justices, but as far as somebody who understood, and I like that, you can only protect your liberties in this world by protecting the other man's freedom. My wife and I went to see Bridge of Spies last night with Tom Hanks. And I know some folks who know Tom Hanks pretty well, but he doesn't choose scripts lightly. And this is Spielberg and Hanks working together, and it's a masterpiece. And it deals with the Gary Powers U-2 spy plane and just how close we came to the brink of nuclear war in the late 50s. And it's based on true events, which means they've probably taken some latitude, but all the facts pertaining therein are very accurate. And I highly recommend you see it. It's a masterpiece, just as Lincoln was and just as Armistead was by Spielberg. They are magnificent movies. But it talks about, and what you're going to see is what binds together us, what makes us different from anyone else in the world. What makes us different from Russia is that we have a constitution and that all people are allowed, have the rights of that constitution. Because in the 1950s, we came and often went over the line of breaking the constitution. And we certainly did in Iraq and Afghanistan when we waterboarded and did things that just completely violated the constitution. And that's on a very slippery slope, if you can get on that. So Darrow was to try to make sure that we didn't get on that slippery slope. And I told you that my father-in-law was at the monkey trials in 1926 in Dayton, Ohio, at the Dayton, Tennessee, thank you. I've been in Dayton, Ohio so many times I can't count it. But Dayton, Tennessee, and saw Darrow and William Jennings Bryan, because that was a real show. And of course, what they were talking about was teaching evolution in the schools. And Darrow's idea, Darrow's principle was, I'm not here to defend whether I believe in evolution or don't believe in evolution. I'm defending your right to speak what you believe in. And that's what it's about. And Inherit the Wind, of course, with Spencer Tracy and Frederick March in their respective roles as Bryan and Darrow, it's just a magnificent movie also. And you can get that on YouTube and all sorts of things now, and I heartily recommend it, especially the passage where he says the loneliest feeling in the world, which is what poor Scopes had to go through to speak what he believed. And Darrow, at one point he just stops him cold when he wants to give up, and he says, you can give up. And when you do, and you say, I'll be like everybody else, every door will be open to you, and every table will welcome you to dinner, and you will be brought in. But you have to understand what you're giving up inside yourself to do that. And so, anyway, it's not my cause, it's not his cause, it's what you have the right to say. And that's why I'm here, is why Darrow. But that's what Darrow was. Darrow was an incredibly highly paid, we're talking about way into six figures in today's income, by the railroad. And what he would do is go after the people who the railroad were mad at. And of course, because of the power of the railroad, he could crush them. But he finally realized that it was blood money. And he turned around and he defended, for example, Eugene Debs on the strike that he said for the railroad. And they were going after Debs with the idea that because he was on strike and it stopped the trains from going through, it also stopped the mail, and therefore he was breaking a federal law of disrupting the United States mail. So they were going to manipulate the law any way they could to crush the idea of labor being able to come up and have some rights. And also when Rockefeller, who had a mine around the turn of the century in Colorado, and the workers were going on strike, he sent in the National Guard, which opened up fire and burned the camp and killed women and children. And that's what helped set in motion the ability of people to be able to have rights to fight back that would hold up in court. But Darrow was a chief exponent of that. And as you can tell, I admire him very much. When I covered federal court for NBC for 6 years, from 86 to 92, I watched Morris Dees. Morris Dees is probably will go down in history as one of the great attorneys of the latter part of the 20th century and into this. He started the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama, which is huge. But I covered the civil trial of the last African-American lynched in the United States, and I hope he is the last American that happened to, back in the early 80s, who was oh dear. You go over 60 and things just start going out there where you can't quite grasp them.
It doesn't get any better.
Oh, thank you very much. Michael Donald was his name. Thank you. Thank you very much. There was a Michael Donald, and the police didn't want to make it look like a Klan trial, but my good friend Bob Eddy, who's the best investigator the state's ever had, discovered that it was definitely linked to the Klan. And so they did bring out the Klan. And I was at the trial where for the first time they brought out the inner workings of the Klan. And if ever there was a bigger bunch of moronic cretins on earth, it's the Ku Klux Klan. Certainly in those days. The head of it, Benny Jack Hayes, was illiterate to the point where the prosecutor was up questioning him, and there were 13 witnesses in a row that said Benny Jack Hayes was lying on the stand. And when he came to the 13th, the prosecutor said, well, this person said this, and he said, they're a liar. And he said, well, this is your own daughter, sir. And he said, well, even she lies sometimes. And so he said, well, sir, this person said this, and he said, that's a lie. And he said, sir, this is your own deposition. Would you please read your own words for the court? And he took it and he threw it down and he said, can't read today. And of course, somebody in the audience, it wasn't me, said, or any other day. But that's the kind of people that were in this. And I found out what a whipping boy was. I didn't know about that. But to sit there. But I'm going to tell you, did I tell you about Mrs. Donald the other day? Okay. Mrs. Donald is put forward the greatest act of Christian charity I could ever hope to witness. Now, her son was literally beaten to death, thrown into the trunk of a car, taken in to a house in Mobile, and hung. And these guys were just horrible that did this. And one of the two on death row came in. His name was Tiger Knowles. And when his testimony began, he was sitting there as though he was reading a phone book, saying, yes, we hit him multiple times. Well, he wouldn't use the word as high as multiple, but we hit him a bunch of times and so on and so forth. But Mrs. Donald sat there every day, and she was there to represent her son. And she was not going, no histrionics, nothing. She sat there every day because she was representing the memory of her son, and I sat as close to her as I am to you. And she never broke countenance. She always held her head up high. She clutched her bag on her lap, and she just sat there and she would listen to these things that these people were telling about beating her son to death, taking him, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes tears would be streaming down her cheeks, but she never broke countenance. And that's absolutely astounding. And after all these things, and on the final day of Tiger Knowles' testimony, he stopped in the middle of a sentence, and he looked at her and he said, ma'am, I only hope you can forgive me for what I've done. And without a second's hesitation, she said, young man, I already have. And there was not a dry eye in that room. And if you can imagine, I mean, I have a son who's, if that happened to my son, I don't know if I would be capable of that kind of charity, knowing the kind of people that had done this. But she was, just like that, she did it. So that's greatness to me. And that's where Morris Dees is a champion of justice. And he's the one that made, what he started with is, you can't punish these people enough by incarcerating them. What you do is you take the money away from them. Their ability to spread their propaganda, and that's what he did. Mrs. Donald ended up owning the Klan's headquarters in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and all of their assets. And of course, she gave it away, but nonetheless, that's what helped break the back of that. My favorite story about the Klan is Roger Mudd, who my wife met when she was very young, because George Wallace had come to Fairhope to campaign when he was just getting started back in the early 60s. And my wife was just as cute, she still is, but I mean, she's just as cute as she could be, a little girl. Blonde, blue-eyed, you get the picture. And so Wallace was talking to people, and my wife was just standing there like that. And he took her arm, and she said he locked it in his and pinned her so that he was walking around with this beautiful blonde-haired little girl. And that just looked good for him to do that. And as he came, Roger Mudd came with NBC, and he said, may I talk to you, Mr. Wallace? And Wallace said, well, sure, I will. And he said, and who's this charming little girl? And my wife said that Wallace ungot her, pushed her, kind of let her out of the way, and basically said, what little girl? Because he wasn't going to share the spotlight with anybody. But Roger Mudd, at about that same time, was covering a civil rights march in Georgia. I mean, a Klan march in Georgia. And he walked up to the guy who was holding his pointy little hat to the side, and big old fellow with a beard, and he said, and who are you, sir? And he said, I'm the grand, all high and mighty potentate of the Georgia Ku Klux Klan. And Roger Moore said, would you share that? Roger Mudd said, would you spell that for me, please? And of course, the guy, he turned and walked off. But to me, that's, I think impotent is what he would have put in there instead of potentate. But
You were talking about Whipping Boy, I never finished that.
well, just to show you how heinous these people were, they had a severely Down syndromed young man that they invited into their organization. And these are a bunch of cruel, sadistic people. And they had this fancy rule book where they had all kinds of little infractions and little secret ceremonies and things that they went through, which is garbage. But this really marginally, retarded fellow would always mess up. Well, they'd say, well, we're sorry, Ernie, you've messed up, and now you got to be whipped. That's our do that. So they literally had a whip, and they literally whipped them. And then when they got done with that, they'd put a little sponge, some water on them, and they'd say, well, Ernie, don't do that again. We'll make sure that doesn't happen. And they'd bring him back in. And finally he figured out that they were just using him. Nobody else seemed to get whipped, and he always managed to be the end of that. And even though he had a dim bulb, it finally lit up, and he turned state's evidence against him. So we get him on the stand. But that's the kind of people these are. If they are not champions of anything except cowardice. That's all they are, just a bunch of cowards. Anyway, so that's Darrow, and God bless him. And he used to come to Fairhope, and he'd stay at the school, and he'd go talk to E.B. Gaston and all kinds of folks around town. And he dared to go to Mobile and speak about human rights. In other words, that all of us are equal. And they basically ran him out of town. He was staying in Fairhope, and a bunch of, most cars were black in those days, but a bunch of black sedans pulled up. They pulled him out, put him in the back of the sedan, took him to Bay Minette, and said, you can either leave on the train or not leave at all. And so he left. He did come back later, I understand, but nonetheless, Fairhope was kind of an island in an ocean of small-mindedness. I think it'd be a good name for it. Kathleen Wheeler, that's certainly a sculpture of Clarence Darrow. She lived in Fairhope for a while. She did a number of very fine sculptures in her time. It's not too easy to find out anything about her, but we have several. She did Marietta Johnson. She did E.B. Gaston. Darrow, good work. She was a good artist. Francis Gaither. This is not Francis Gaither. You cannot find a picture of Francis Gaither. Number one, Francis Gaither is a man, I found out after I put this thing together. So I will definitely always back off on my, if I'm wrong. But she wrote several best-selling books, The Scarlet Coat and Follow the Drinking Gourd, very Southern-oriented books, and was very popular. The Red Cock Crows was also a bestseller that she did. But try finding a picture of them. It's not easy. We also had Eleanor Risley. We had Baker Brownell, who wrote very influential Arthur. He was a good friend of Frank Lloyd Wright's. And then we went over a little bit of Henry Stewart's the other day. I told you that he did marvelous weavings and built a roundhouse because dust doesn't gather in the corners on that. But he was an important part of Fairhope's life and came here because of the intellectual freedoms, and he could live outside and be a hermit. And where he lived was very remote.
Two of the gals who left this morning went out to the house yesterday afternoon.
Well, now it's in the middle of a little strip office building. I want to move it to Fairhope, but that's not going to be easy to do. This, of course, is indicative of a lot of the arts. The bricks here were made in kilns near the bay. Pottery was the largest industry in Baldwin County in the 19th century. And there were huge brickworks and other things that were along, and there were beehive kilns, however you pronounce it, all along the bay and on the rivers. Clay City Road is where they made Clay City tile and pottery for years. And Whiskey jugs were very popular to make. Well, the jugs weren't popular. What was in them was extremely popular. But anyway, it was a big industry in Baldwin County. Marie Howland, there she is. She's the one that used to throw a towel over her shoulder and a bar of soap. And she founded our library, and I told you that she wrote Papa's Own Girl, among other pieces of literature, that this was banned in Boston because she felt women should have equal rights and the freedom to do what they wanted to pursue, equally with men. Scandalous ideas, of course, for their time. Founded our library, the first public library in the state of Alabama, and lived here for 22 years when she passed on. But, and she had her own, here's you see this up here? This is not the Dewey Decimal System. She had, I mean, she might put Moby Dick under G for great book. I mean, she had her own system, and of course she was the master of her own system, but eventually they evolved into what is now the Dewey Decimal System. And, but she was quite a gal. I have a lot of respect for her. Isadora Duncan dancers, of course, Isadora is credited with the invention of modern dance. She had a whole bunch of young ladies who sometimes they were called the Isadorables, but all of her dancers took her last name, so they were all Duncan. And she didn't come to Fairhope. She was killed she used to wear long scarves, and she was, it's not fully apocryphal, and this is how she died, but she had a scarf in a car, I believe it was with Bugatti, and it was a Bugatti car, but it has those revolving, sticking out wheel hubcaps, and her scarf got caught in it, snapped her neck. But the art world lost a great dancer and free spirit. Yeah. But one of her dancers, Winifred Duncan, came to Fairhope and lived there the rest of her life. And she was an interesting character. But she got quite a bit of scientific aplomb when she wrote The Private Life of the Protozoa and Webs in the Wind, the habits of web weaving spiders, because she made some pretty interesting observations that have gotten into the formal understanding of spiders. But later on, she decided that spiders had individual personalities. I guess she read Charlotte's Web too many times. But that sort of pulled her out of the scientific. They had to kind of distance themselves from her. And she also wrote The Private Life of a Protozoa. I have not read either of these two books. I'm either glad nor sorry to say. Protozoa are important to a lot of people, but not to me. But she also was a very, very free spirit, and she constantly had people coming and going, and she would wear men's clothing all over town. She was one of those, people. But in Fairhope, hey, we had lots of one of those in Fairhope. And there was often alcohol involved, too, if you go into the stories. And I knew some of the people that used to hang out with her. She was gone by the time I came here, but Doc Dakovich and others who, this just interesting story. She was quite a gal. Edith and Converse Harwell's pottery, I talked a little about her and her kiln, which is still there. See the smoke billowing out of that rascal up there? These things get up into the 2,000 degree range at times. So there's a whole lot of wood and a whole lot of stoking that goes on. I have a friend that has a kiln out in the country, and when that thing gets going, it's like you stick a jet in the ground upside down with the flame just coming out of it. It just roars and shoots straight up. So there's an awful lot to producing pottery. The steps at the museum, the walkways, were all made locally by our local potter. He's crazy too. Anna Braun. Anna Braun was one of the best children's illustrators. Her work was shown in Paris. She worked with, is it Lord & Burnham? That's a very fancy department store in New York. Lord & Taylor, thank you. She worked with Lord & Taylor in the 20s. And Lord & Taylor, they went through a phase where instead of painting your walls, you would buy large painted screens, customized by Lord & Taylor. That's right. And some of her screens were so good that they exhibited them in Paris. And her illustrations were absolutely wonderful, too. I think I explained a little bit about her, that she was a little too fond of all animals because her house was infested with mice as she got older. And she got myasthenia gravis and several other ailments and was almost bedridden. And we had to go in and clean up her house because my mother-in-law was the executor of her estate. And she wouldn't let us put out rat poison because of her little friends, because she thought that they were, you can see see the cute little mouse there? That's Anna's house. But did I tell you about her cat? My wife remembers when she was a little girl, she had a cat that when she came home, and Anna always wore long white gloves. It was just a fashion that we have a lot of her clothes that we've kept, and some of them are in a museum because it's very fashionable. But she had long white gloves, and she had a cat when she came home who would sit up on the bureau, and she'd hold out her hand, and it would take about 20 minutes, but the cat would pull off each finger and take off the glove, and then she'd do this on the other side. So it's about 40 minutes, and my wife said it was very entertaining the first few times you saw it, but after that it got a little much. But that was Anna. She just had extreme patience, and she was a librarian at the Fairhope Library for many years. But when my wife was little and other children were small, when they came to the library, which was a magic place, we had cases full of things like a petrified finger from somebody, and sort of oddities that were there, like shrunken head, or it's not occult, but it was just kind of interesting stuff. But Anna, when you got to the library, she'd have a stack of books from my wife that she thought she would enjoy, ready for her. And so that was the kind of library that we grew up with, she grew up with in Fairhope. Gretchen Riggs was wonderful. This is my wife's mother, who helped set up Theater 98, which is a thriving theater. Yes, they do. Thank God she looks like her mother, is all I can say. Gretchen Riggs was a powerhouse in theater for about 50 years in Fairhope. And she was a marvelous director, pianist, just a theatrical bon vivant. She was wonderful. And practiced up into her 80s. And I happened to stop by when I'd first I'd only been in Fairhope a couple of years, to see a rehearsal of one of the plays. And when I walked in, Gretchen Riggs had collapsed because her hip had broken, and she'd collapsed on the floor. And they all gathered around her, and she said, "Oh, until the ambulance gets here, just keep going. I'll direct you from here." And she literally, I remember her on the floor going, "Enter stage left, and speak up when you do it this time." But that was her last directorial. But she was almost 90, when that happened. But God bless her, she did a lot. Her husband invented Velveeta cheese, and so they had some. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but nonetheless, she was comfortable enough to. But her theater was never cheesy. I have to tell you that. Nor was she Swiss. She was definitely American. We've had a lot of very interesting musicians and folks around town. We had, of course, from the very early beginnings, we had a Baldwin County orchestra, because whenever you have people who are eclectic in their thought patterns, music is a very important part of their lives. Jack Normand had 3 sons, Danny, Glenn, and Robert, and they had Janine, their daughter. They played at the Grand Hotel. He used to be by himself, and then as the kids grew up, they all started coming in on first the duo, trio, quartet, et cetera. And they were legends at the Grand Hotel. He's the one that befriended Paul Harvey and brought him to visit with my father-in-law, who he befriended. And I told you the story about the door, didn't I? Yeah. Okay, does everybody remember that? Okay, good. Well, anyway, so with that, it's Jack Normand's responsible for that, and they put out records and played for all kinds of very impressive people at the Grand Hotel. You've had Tom Morley. You couldn't have a better representative. Whenever Tom follows me, I always say, "Here we go from the ridiculous to the sublime," because Tom is just incredible and adds so much to our local culture. And I told you that when we were dedicating the sculpture that I built in Gaucher, which is the largest on the Gulf Coast, Tom produced an original piece of music for it called Fanfare for the Gulf Coast, which is marvelous. And if you watch the YouTube video of my sculpture on my website, you can hear Tom's music in the background. He did a great job. Piney Gaston, she was born Woods. That was her maiden name. And because she was so tall and thin, they called her Piney Woods. And then later she became Piney Woods Gaston, or just Piney, as everybody called her. And she, I think I told you the other day that she was a dear friend, and when our daughter was very little, she really loved our daughter, and when she died, she left her $1,000. And that sat in the bank account until our daughter bought her first computer. And she bought that with the money that Piney gave her. So here's someone who was born literally before the last century was over, who helped fund a computer into the next century. I think that's pretty neat. Cleveland Woodward, I talked about him. He was my mentor. Our son Cleveland is named for Cleveland Woodward. His work is in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, as other places. He did biblical illustrations for World Publishing, which was a best-selling New Testament for many years. I think it's still in print. There's some of his biblical paintings. My father-in-law was one of his regular models. My daughter even posed for young Arab children. And she really doesn't have too many features, but Mr. Woodward knew how to make that work. But he literally went to the Holy Land in the 1930s and 40s and bought the homespun robes off the backs of the people. You know, he'd literally buy the same, and this is when they used the same dyes and materials and weavings that they had done for thousands of years. That doesn't happen anymore. But I have all of his collections, and I want to give them to a museum someday because it's an incredible collection of authentic biblical costumes. And that's what he used in all of these. But he was an amazing human being. He's the reason I moved to Fairhope. There's my father-in-law. We call that the Pirate. This is a cartoon that our friend J.D. Crowe did. You know J.D. very well, Devereaux. That's the house that he built, and I've rebuilt that, or made it modern in many ways. But his wood carving is just absolutely incredible. You saw some of that the other day. There's the sculpture. This is the first sculpture of an artist in Alabama's history, according to Al Head, who's the head of the Arts and Humanities section of the state. State Arts.
Alabama State Council on the Arts.
Alabama State Council on the Arts. And that's the first piece of public art that was done in Fairhope, which was the Celebration of Life. This was to celebrate the return of the brown pelican, because after they were severely endangered for many years because of DDT. And after they discontinued the use of DDT, slowly but surely, the brown pelicans and other birds began to come back. So this was the first celebratory sculpture of its kind that my father-in-law did. And those birds weigh about 250 pounds each. I know because I helped carry them up the scaffolding to get there. And how he secured all those into the pilings and such, it really is a testament to his understanding of engineering. My mother-in-law, here she is again in her theater pose. She was an incredible woman. To be married to my father-in-law and make it work and not murder him, she had to be a remarkable human being. Did I tell you about the Fantastics quote that she loved to quote? It's in the play of the Fantastics, which she was in at one point, but there's one of the characters asks the other, have you ever considered divorce? And there's a pause and she goes, no. Murder, but not divorce. So my wife thinks that's very funny too for some reason. But and there's my heart right there. And this is shortly after we were married. There is her dance partner, Carl Belk, for most of her time. Carl is a wonderful human being, but he had a dead thumb. And so sometimes when he'd have my wife up in one of these great lifts and carrying her, her thumb was sticking straight up into her back, and she has to go, so sometimes she'd have a bruise back there for quite a while. But that's what you have to do in the dance, is you have to look gorgeous and graceful and all that sort of thing. This is her dance theater. Right now she's doing a production of Peter and the Wolf and Where the Wild Things Are as we speak this morning to several thousand school children. And it's marvelous. Both shows are just fantastic. There I am. There's some of my stuff. That's me a long time ago. That's even before I met my wife, back when I was young. Well, watch this. You're about to see my son. He does just look a little bit like me. That's one of the that's the painting I told you about the founders that I did. There's our book that we wrote. That's our daughter, Megris. Thank God she looks like her mother. She's everything. She's an aerial contortionist, which means she works on silks like Cirque du Soleil. She's been a personal assistant on television shoots and movie shoots in New York. She's about to fly out to LA to be, you all don't know who Victoria Justice is because you're not 14. But if you were 14, you know, you go, ooh, Victoria Justice. She was a Nickelodeon star for about 10 years, and now she's branching out into, she's got a semi-remake of Mean Girls that's coming out this fall. But anyway, that's, my daughter was her personal assistant, and they've become good friends and such. And she was put together, and she went through microfiche. And if you've ever gone through microfiche, it is God awful to try to read that stuff. You have to just, but she went through something like 150,000 words of microfiche to pull out the best of my father-in-law's Mark Twain type articles that he did from 47 to 52. And he had an incredible life, to say the least. There she is in her, doing some of her aerial work. I think she and the Spider Lady would have gotten along very well if you look at the one over there. She oftentimes goes down, she's very particular about the trees that she hangs her silks from. But she can do this and drop, and she's probably performing right now at the Civic Center in between shows while they set up for one to the other. This is some of my son's work. He did, Nike is the name of this one. And he also does lots of work. There he is, and if I went back to my picture when I was about his age, you'd see a remarkable similarity. When my grandfather had my father was born, and the doctor had delivered the baby and came out and looked at my grandfather, and he said, well, you can't blame that on the milkman, can you? So, because he looked so much alike, so my son certainly. And this is again some of his portrait work that he's doing right now. He just did 2 paintings for the Nicolas Cage movie that they filmed in Mobile about the Indianapolis that is coming out next year, and they'll be in the courtroom scene. And that was, I'm glad he got that. That's going to be a good exposure for his career.
How old is he?
23.
Very young, I was gonna say.
He's worked pretty hard. He doesn't wash dishes worth a damn, but he does pretty good in his artwork. But the older I get, the more I appreciate good dishwashing, I have to tell you. This is just a hodgepodge of some of our best, of the best authors. Judy, of course, and Terry Klein. I'd almost say they were the solid rock of continuum for the last 30 years of literature in Fairhope. But you've also got Winston Groom, who wrote Forrest Gump, Fannie Flagg, of course, Betty Jo Wolfe, who ran the Page and Palette, and now her granddaughter is running Page and Palette, Karen Wilson. Judy has just written a book called Thelonious Rising, which is fabulous, and it's about the Ninth Ward in New Orleans during and after Katrina, and it's beautifully done. So you've got lots and lots. When y'all were in the studio, I didn't show you the whistle stop of the fried green, the cafe door that I have behind my easel back there. But Fanny's a good friend and often stops by when she's in town. So I think that wraps it up.